Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. Today I'm going to be making a close encounter papercut art piece for Boylai Hobby Time's monthly craft challenge. So let's just get right into it. This month's theme was close encounters, and when I read that, I immediately thought of this lightbox that I made a long time ago of a scuba diver encountering this huge anglerfish that's gonna swallow him whole. And that project turned out really well, so I thought it would be cool to revisit this world with the same diver but a different sea creature. So I came up with this quick sketch of a giant eel monster in a bunch of seagrass and kelp, and the diver is trying to shoot him with a harpoon gun, and this is my close encounter idea. Boylai Hobby Time is a really cool craft channel who makes lots of dioramas, so if you want to check him out, I'll leave the link down below. So let's get right into the work. I started off by getting 10 sheets of cardstock 8.5 by 11 inches and drawing a 1/2 inch border around them. This border will have the foam board strips glued on to create depth when I stack it, but for now I just draw on the edge and I start sketching out my layers. While I was coming up with this idea, I looked at a lot of references of different fish and sea environments to try to come up with this piece. And I settled on an eel because I thought it could look quite a bit different than the previous project with this diver character, and I also just liked the look of the long slithering body amongst the seagrass. And originally I looked at pictures and I wanted kelp, so I started drawing out a few layers of kelp-like plants, but I kinda didn't end up liking it, so I stuck to the seagrass idea. Sometimes I think simpler is better, and I liked how my sketch looked, so I didn't want to go a different route and not like it. And also, this project was a little bit difficult to get through because unfortunately we had to put down my senior dog while I was working on this, and that was really heartbreaking, and I was really sad while making this, but it was a good distraction to help get over him. I'll insert a picture here. He was such a sweetheart and I miss him every day. But yeah, this project was a good little distraction from that. So instead of the kelp, I stuck with the grassy shapes, and every layer except 2 will be this grass, so I just started off by drawing. The only thing I wanted to keep in mind was that I wanted the grass to create a little circle in the middle, and I wanted the front layers of grass to be thinner and smaller than in the background. So I started in the back and I did really big, long, tall pieces of the seagrass winding around. And as I worked my way to the foreground, they became smaller and created a little U shape to leave a clearing in the center. And this process was really simple. So while we're working on this, since it's so simple, I'm going to tell you a story that my sister came up with for this lightbox. She worked really hard on it, so I hope you guys enjoy. The sun was warm on Ben's face as he shuffled along the dock towards his rental boat. The vessel bobbed in the water in front of him. It reminded him of a rubber ducky he had often played with when he was a small child. The water underneath it was churning and frothy from the constant swaying motion. A bright red styrofoam cup floated nearby, hitting the boat's sleek side every 10 seconds or so. Ben followed its motion with his eyes longer than he would have liked. In fact, he did not even notice that he had stopped walking until the side of a huge leather purse shoved him over. He had to move all the way to the edge of the dock to let the woman pass. The leather bag, which had invaded his personal space, swung freely from her shoulder. Clutched in her right hand were the short, stubby fingers of an incredibly young child. He licked at a cone of ice cream as he waddled next to his mother. Not long after they had passed, a man appeared out of the nearby building that held the restrooms. Excitedly, he walked up to the woman and took the boy's other hand in his. He shuffled his family onto a big boat a few boats down from Ben's. He looked at them for a second, then turned back to the boat in front of him. A large-frame, big-bearded, mustache-wearing man in his mid-50s sat slumped over the railing that surrounded the deck of his ship. His name was Patrick Little. He was the boat's captain. His chapped, wrinkled face moved into a smile as soon as Ben walked aboard the small vessel. Those features made him instantly likable. They greeted each other cheerfully and settled in for the long boat ride. The bark of a large dog echoed in the distance as the boat pulled away from the dock. The ocean in front of the boat was a deep, beautiful blue as they sailed away from the shore towards their destination. The skies above were the same calming blue as the water. A group of seagulls flew amongst the white sheep-like clouds just as Ben decided to crane his neck so he could look up at the sky. A light, pleasant breeze ruffled his hair and the boat swayed under his feet, making him relax. As he sat down on the deck and leaned his back against the railing, Ben was completely in his elements. He was on his way for another daring adventure with high risks and even higher rewards. Ben had always felt the call to adventure. Since before he even graduated high school, he started working for a man named Rich Simmons. Rich was a notorious crook. He studied and researched the whereabouts of various priceless artifacts. After he was certain of a treasure's location, Rich devised a cunning plan and sent Ben to steal it. Ben loved the action and the peril. However, there were sides of working with Rich that were not so fun. Since he was the one who had to do all the dirty work, he was the one who got in trouble when things went wrong. Also, being a mean crook, Rich was far from reliable when it came to paying. However, after all of this, Ben was not sure he would be able to figure out how to make an honest living, so when Rich had called him up and asked him to sneak up a priceless sword that had fallen off a ship somewhere in the Pacific Ocean as it was being shipped back to California after an analogical dig, Ben had accepted the mission with a sigh. 5 hours later, the boat arrived at the coordinates Rich had given Ben. As Patrick dropped the anchor, Ben did his best to balance on the tilting listing deck as he pulled the scuba suit over his body. His head swam from nervousness and his heart hammered with excitement as he fitted his mask over his face and lowered himself into the chilly, churning water. Ben allowed himself one more good look at the sky with its peaceful clouds before submerging his head and started to swim downwards with slow, powerful strokes. As soon as Ben stuck his face into the water, he entered a magical world of whimsy. The rays of the sun filtering through the water created shimmering shafts of light. Tiny fish in every imaginable color darted in and out of lush forests of kelp. It was so soothing and peaceful, Ben would have been content to float there forever. However, he had limited oxygen, so he had to start moving. Underneath Ben, as far as he could see, a thick layer of kelp and seagrass grew. A deep sense of discomfort traveled through Ben's body as he stared down into the depths. Ben had no idea what could be floating around under his feet, so it took him a moment to will himself forward. The fish accompanied him as he swam downwards. The thick strands of kelp and seagrass were so thick and dense that he could hardly see. His diving flippers would get caught and stuck, and he had to struggle and kick to get them unstuck. He didn't like this, but he had to keep going. He reached a small little patch of clearing between all the grass, and he floated there, catching his breath and looking at his surroundings. Unfortunately, the next moment, all of the fish started to panic. They shot through the water in a million different directions like many colorful darts. It took them less than a minute to disappear, and a second later, Ben found out why. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the sound of a strong, powerful tail swishing through the water settled in. Ben's heart climbed into his throat from panic as a large, sleek eel slid out from amongst the kelp. It had dark, tiny little eyes that stared at him, and a mouth of thin, long, pointy fangs. His dark green body was slimy and slick, speckled with dots of light. With the speed of a bullet, it collided with Ben in an attempt to drown him. He ducked and dodged around its powerful tail, trying to find an opening where he could lodge his harpoon. However, he could not find any. He was forced to just start shooting blindly. One of his hits actually stuck, and the water around them was stained red as it penetrated its thick, smooth skin. Unfortunately, the creature did not lose strength from its wound, and the panic only made it thrash harder. Ben was not permeated by its heightened level of energy and failed to notice its tail flying straight towards his face until it was too late. Ben ducked, but he was not able to dodge the wiggling appendage, and with a terrible crunching sound, the blow damaged the tank of air that was strapped to his back. Almost instantly, the air started to stream out. Just as the tank started losing air, Ben spotted a battered wooden box tangled amongst the kelp about 10 feet below him. He had no doubt that it held the artifact he was looking for, and he wanted nothing more than to swim down and claim it as his own. However, his oxygen level was critically low, so he had no choice but to swim for the surface. Fortunately, as soon as Ben started paddling towards the surface and clearing the kelp, the eel gave up on the fight and decided to retreat back into its home amongst the kelp. Unfortunately, he was almost completely out of air. His head was feeling incredibly light, and he was gasping for breath inside his mask. He did not even notice that the tiny fish had returned. All of his focus went to moving his limbs and holding his breath. His vision started to go, and just as he thought he was done, Ben's head burst through the surface of the water. Finally, he was able to breathe huge, greedy breaths as Patrick helped to pull him up onto the boat. Once he was successfully back on the boat, Ben spent a long time just shaking and sputtering. He must have looked terrible because Patrick opened the cooler and was leaning next to the railing, grabbed a bottle of beer and handed it to him. Ben popped the lid and chugged it down gratefully. It was only after the drink was gone that he was able to grab his phone from his pockets of his shorts to make the call. Unfortunately, they had been woefully underprepared for this job. They did not even have another oxygen tank on board and would have to come back another day. Ben sighed as he dialed Rich's number. He had known him ever since he was a teen and knew that Rich hated to receive bad news, but someone had to tell him that he was forced to come home empty-handed. 10 minutes later, Ben put down the phone and sat down on the deck and leaned back to admire the ocean. Took deep breaths of the chilly evening air as he tried to drive the strain of the day's adventure and Rich's cursing out of his head. So that was the story. I hope you guys enjoyed. I really love it, and I think my sister did a great job. But let's get back to the video. Now that the environment is done, it's time to move on to the giant eel. I drew out a little sausage shape that's going to be the fish. Then I cut out the shape of the eel. Then I thought it could look really cool if the body continued down across the bottom and came up on the other side, so it looks like he's wrapping himself around the diver or sneaking up on him. So I decided to just draw a piece out and glue it on and see how it looked, and I really liked it, so I kept it and continued. For the long fin along the eel's back, I used sketching paper. I like using a combination of cardstock, tracing paper, sketching paper to create these details and make things pop. I traced the shape of the two fins, and I wanted the bottom one to kind of wrap around the body so it looks like it's twisting. And then I went through and I cut a bunch of tiny little bubbly holes out of these fins to add the look that these are really tattered fins. Then I glued those two pieces in place on the eel with Elmer's glue. Then I moved on to the mouth. I decided to use sketching paper for it, so I traced out the shape of the mouth opening onto the paper. I wanted the eye to look really sinister, and I wanted it to look darker. I basically cut the shape of the eye out on a second sheet of cardstock, and I cut out the tiny little pupil, and I will glue this over the eye on the fish so it'll look darker. And now I go back and I remake that mouthpiece out of cardstock, and I add teeth to this one. Cutting out these teeth was a little bit tricky. They're so thin, and when the paper is pointy and really thin like this, the tips fray and it kind of looks a little ugly. I try my best to cut as nicely and neatly as possible to kind of minimize that. Then I create two sets of teeth for the front half of the mouth. Then I cut them out and glue them in place. I wanted the mouth to have some dimension. I didn't want it to look flat. I took some thin, I think this is 1/4 inch thick foam board, and I cut tiny little strips, and I smushed them down and flattened them because even this is a little too thick. And when I glue the two pieces of the mouth together, I glued this in between them so there's a little bit of depth there. And last but not least, for this fish face, I created two little nostrils, and I wanted a few little lines around the eyes, and I like what these two little details added. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the eel's body, so I decided to stick to something that I knew I would like, which is poking a bunch of tiny holes with a pin. This works really well. It lights up things and it adds little speckly details. I concentrated the amount of holes near the fins. A lot of eels have this stretchy looking throat, so I wanted to add something like that to my eel. So I just kind of bulged out the neck a little bit, and I cut a few strips of sketching paper and glued them on to add a little detail. If you enjoy my projects and you would like to support me a little bit, I have a Patreon set up. There's nothing really on there right now. I'm going to post more, but for now it's just for support if you want to. I have a lot of really cool big projects in mind, but it's hard to make them happen. So if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description below. But now let's get back to the video. If you look at my previous project with this diver, you can see that the background has lots of circles, and I thought it could be a really cool way to tie these two together and make them cohesive. So I decided to create a little circular light action in the background. I used a bowl to trace a circle in the cardstock. I cut it out. Then I used that same bowl to trace a circle in sketching paper, and I cut that out and glued over the hole. Then I cut a hole out of the sketching paper using a mug, and then I used that same mug to cut a hole out of tracing paper, and I glued that circle of tracing paper over the hole. There is one more thing that's missing, which is the little diver. And I think he looks okay. He doesn't look amazing, but he looks a lot better than my previous diver. I used the exact same technique to make him as I did last time. I wanted to keep that consistent at least. So I got a Sharpie and I colored in his diving suit. Here's the finished diver. I think he looks pretty cute, but now I have to glue him onto the layer. And I just attached his foot to a piece of the seagrass. And now this project is ready to assemble. I got a bunch of 1/2-inch thick strips of foam board. I cut them to the length and width of my paper, and I glued these strips along the border that I drew on my layers. Then I stacked these layers on top of each other, gluing them in place. And I add an LED light in the back, and here is the finished product. I'm super happy with how this looks. I chose this mythical green color. It matches the seagrass, and I really like how this whole thing turned out. I love the eel. I think it looks really cool. I kind of wish the seagrass would have been a little thicker in some parts, but it turned out okay, and I'm overall really happy with this. But yeah, comment down below, let me know what you thought. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and checking out my Patreon. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Bye!